In this presentation, we're going to go through the Pesach Seder, and we're going to start by first going through the 15 Simanim. So we have Kadeish, Urchatz, Karpas, Yachatz, Maggid, Rachtza, Motzi, Matza, Maror, Koreich, Shulchan Oreich, Tzafun, Beirach, Halel, and Nirtza. So let's start by seeing why is this the order of the 15 Simanim. So to start, there are two mitzvahs at the Seder that are min Torah, and one mitzvah that is midirabanan. The two that are min Torah are number one, saying the Haggadah, and number two, eating matzah. And the one that's midirabanan is eating maror. And as we'll see, there's another couple of things which are eating the afikomen, which is a zecher to the Karpas Pesach, and saying Halel. Now, when it comes to these two categories of mitzvahs that are min Torah and midirabanan, so there's two things to know. Number one is that those that are min Torah come before that which is midirabanan. And number two, since the Haggadah has to be said while the matzahs are in front of us, because you're supposed to say the Haggadah on all the things of the Seder, so therefore saying the Haggadah comes before eating the matzah. And with that in mind, we can now look at the Seder of these 15 items, these 15 parts or stages or steps of the Seder. So number one, we have Kiddush, and the reason is because Kiddush is always first. It's when we're Mekadesh the day. Then number two, we have the next four items, which is Urchatz, Karpas, Yachatz, and Maggid. So the Haggadah is min Torah, and it has to be said, like we already pointed out, while the matzahs and other items are in front of us. So Maggid is next. And the reason we first do Urchatz, Karpas, and Yachatz is because they come before Maggid. Because we do two things before Maggid. Yachatz and Karpas. And Karpas, which is when we dip a vegetable in salt water, requires us to first wash our hands, as we have to do anytime we eat a wet vegetable. Now, why do we have to do these two things before Maggid? So Yachatz, because the Haggadah has to be said on a broken matzah, on lechem eini. And Karpas, we dip a vegetable in liquid to make the children ask about it. So we have Kadeish, and then we have Maggid, and it's that before Maggid we have to do both Yachatz and Karpas requires Urchatz before it. Moving along, the next thing we do is Matzah. Matzah is next, since it's min Torah. And it's just that before Matzah, as before eating any bread, we must first wash our hands, which is Rachtza, and say the bracha of a Motzi, which is Motzi. So basically we have Kaddish, then Maggid, and then Matzah. Next is Maror and Koreich. Maror is midirabanan, and so it's next. Plus we also eat the Koreich, which is how Halel says to eat Maror. So essentially after the Matzah comes the Maror, and there's two forms of the Maror. Then we move on to Shulchan Oreich, which is the Shabbos Yom Tov. Then we do Tzafun, which is a zecher to the Karpas Pesach, which was eaten when a person was full, so therefore comes after the meal. Next we do Beirach, which is that we bench after we're all done eating, and we conclude with Halel, which is said on the fourth case, and Nirtza is that Hashem accepts our Seder. Now we're just going to point out how you have 5 of these Simanim, so to speak, on every Shabbos in Yom Tov. You have Kaddish, make Kiddush, then Rachtza, we wash our hands, then Motzi, we make the bracha of Motzi and eat the bread, and then we have Shulchan Oreich, the Shabbos Yom Tov, followed by Beirach, which is when we bench. And on Pesach, we're adding Maggid, which brings along with it Urchatz, Karpas, and Yachatz. We're adding Matzah. We're also adding the two different ways of eating Maror. We're adding the zecher for the Karpas Pesach and Tzafun, and then we're concluding with saying Halel, and we have Nirtza. Now, just to point out one thing, which is when we have the Dalet cases, we have one by Kaddish, we have one that we say the Haggadah on, we have one by Beirach when we bench, and one where we say Halel at the end of the Seder. Now we're going to move on to actually go through the Simanim, starting with setting up the kaira. So we begin by setting up the matzahs. We first put the lowest matzah, which is the Yisrael. Upon it, we put the middle matzah, which is the Levi. And on top of that, we put the top matzah, which is the Kohen. Now, some people actually do the opposite. They do Kohen, then Levi, and then Yisrael, which stands for Kli. Kohen, Levi, Yisrael. However, we do Yisrael, Levi, Kohen, which is Yelech. And in terms of the Kli, so we actually make sure to use matzahs that are a little bit bent in, like a Kli, and we set them up in that way that they are like a Kli. So we put them in such a way that the Kli part is facing upwards and not the opposite, that it's like a dome. Now, one thing to point out over here is that throughout the entire Seder, anytime there's instructions like putting the first matzah of the Yisrael, v'olav ha'levi, and v'olav ha'kohen, the Rebbe would actually read out all of these instructions. Now, for the items on the kaira, on the top right is the zroya, and the zroya is there as a zecher for the Karpas Pesach. And what we use for the zroya, the Min Chabad, is to use a chicken neck, and we make sure to take off as much meat as possible, and only to leave a very little bit, in order that it shouldn't at all in any way be like the Karpas Pesach. Then we have an egg, a zecher for the Karban Chagiga, since on the Erev Pesach in Yodal they would bring both a Karban Pesach and a Karban Chagiga. Beneath both of them in the middle we have the Maror, which the Maror that we use in Chabad, lettuce as well as actual chrein. Then beneath the zroya we have the charesis. The charesis is made out of apples, pears, and walnuts, and it's all mushed together. And as we'll see later on, for one of the marors, we also add wine. So it's apples, pears, walnuts, and for one of the marors that we dip it into, we also have wine. And then we have the karpas, which is under the beitza. And for karpas, we use an onion, and woman can use a potato. And then under the two of them, we have the chazeres that we use for koreich. And the chazeres is really the same thing as the maror. It's also lettuce with chrein. And essentially, they're one of the same. And it's a discussion why they have different names. Now let's go through the actual steps of the Seder. So we begin with Kadeish. And in short, what is Kadeish? Kadeish is we make Kiddush. Now, there's a few things to keep in mind. Number one, while drinking the wine, we lean on our left side. However, women don't lean at all during the Seder. Number two, women already said Shechianu by Adlakas Neris. Don't say it again by Kiddush. So that's something that they have to remember. And number three, even those who are Yachatz with the Kiddush of the father, still they must drink their own cup, since everyone is chayiv to drink the Dalet cases, and the first case is the case of Kiddush. Now we move along to Urchatz. So Urchatz is washing one's hands. And there's two things over here. Number one, we wash the same way we always do before eating bread, as we're always supposed to do before eating something wet with water. So we do the same type of washing in terms of washing each hand 3 times, and if you use a towel, v'chulu. And number two, as with all washing before wet foods, we don't make a bracha of al netilas yadayim. Now we move along to Karpas. So Karpas is that we eat the Karpas. There's a few things to keep in mind over here. Number one, we take the karpas that's on the kaira. Number two, we dip it into salt water, and the Rebbe would dip it 3 times into salt water. Number three, we make a bracha of Beirach priya adama. Number four, we have in mind the maror of Maror and the maror of Koreich. Number 5, we don't lean while eating the karpas. Number 6, we eat less than the kazayas of the karpas so that we don't have a problem with a bracha achrena. And number 7, we don't return the karpas to the kaira. And so from this point on, there should now only be 5 items on the kaira. Now we move along to Yachatz. So Yachatz is that we break the middle matzah. So number 1, we break it under the kaira covering. Number 2, we break it in a way that one piece is bigger than the other. Number 3, the bigger one is for the afikamen, and the small one stays in its place in the kaira. Number 4, we break the afikamen piece that we took out into 5 pieces. And number 6, the minig is to place the afikamen in a cloth between pillows, says not to mistakenly eat it. And in Chabad, we don't steal the afikamen. Another thing is that the Rebbe would always turn the matzah so that you couldn't see that it was a broken matzah. You'd see the rounded part on the outside of the kaira. Moving along, now we have Maggid, and later we'll go through the entire Haggadah itself. So Maggid is that we say the Haggadah, and the things that are connected to Maggid are that number 1, we say the Haggadah with a loud voice and with happiness. Number 2, we uncover the matzahs before Heilach Ma'anya, because we're going to say Heilach Ma'anya, so we uncover them, and we do it in such a way that when the top of the matzahs is uncovered, then all 3 matzahs are visible. Number 3, after Heilach Ma'anya, we cover the matzahs and move away the kaira. And we move it away for the children to ask about it. And the reason we cover the matzahs is because we're no longer saying Heilach Ma'anya, and the matzahs only have to be uncovered when we give the answer to the manishtana, as we'll see. Number 4, before manishtana, we pour the 2nd cup of wine and say the Haggadah on it, and we drink that 2nd cup of wine after saying the Haggadah. And number 5, after the manishtana, we again uncover the matzahs, and they're pretty much left uncovered throughout the entire Maggid, because the Maggid, the Haggadah, has to be said on lechem oini, on the matzahs. And as we'll see, there are a few exceptions, which is basically whenever we pick up the cup of wine, we're going to cover the matzahs in order not to embarrass the matzahs. Now we move on to Rachtza. And whenever it came to one of the instructions where a person is not supposed to talk until a later part in the Seder, so then the Rebbe would read all those instructions at once. So before Urchatz, the Rebbe would read the instructions of Urchatz and Karpas. And so to here, the Rebbe by Rachtza would read the instructions of Rachtza, Motzi, Matza, Maror, and Koreich, because a person shouldn't talk from Rachtza until after Koreich. So Rachtza is that we wash our hands. This is the 2nd time that we wash our hands. So we wash our hands before eating matzah, as we do before eating any bread. Then we move on to Motzi. So Motzi is when we make the bracha of HaMotzi, and we make the bracha of HaMotzi before eating the matzah, as we do before eating any bread. And over here we make the bracha of HaMotzi while holding all 3 matzahs. We can't just hold the top 2 matzahs that we're going to eat, because you have to make HaMotzi on every Shabbos and Yom Tov on 2 shleimus. And so we hold all 3 matzahs for the bracha of HaMotzi. Then we move on to matzah, and matzah is when we make the bracha of alachilas matzah and that we eat the matzah. Now there's a few things to keep in mind over here. Number 1, we let go of the bottom matzah and make the bracha of alachilas matzah on the top 2 matzahs. Number 2, we have in mind the koreich, which also has matzah and the afikamen. Number 3, we avoid talking until after eating koreich. Number 4, we break a kazayas from each of the top 2 matzahs and eat them together. So we end up eating 2 kazasim. Number 5, we lean on our left side while eating the matzah. Number 6, we don't use salt on the matzah, and this is for the chavivus of the mitzvah. And finally, number 7, we eat the whole thing in 4 minutes. Moving along, we have maror. So for maror, we eat the maror. And also here, there's a number of things to keep in mind. Number 1, we take a kazayas of maror. Number 2, we soften the charesis with wine. So what we do is we take some of the charesis from the kaira and we put it into the plate where the kiddush cup was in. And so over there's usually some wine left over there, and we soften and moisten the charesis with the wine. Then we dip the maror in the charesis. We shake off the charesis, so we dip it into the charesis. The charesis is like the tit, the mortar that you didn't work with, and then we also shake it off because we want to keep the maror bitter and the charesis is sweet. Then we make a bracha of ala chilas maror. We have in mind the maror in the koreich. We don't lean while eating the maror, and finally we eat it in 4 or at most 7 minutes, since it's midrabanan. So therefore we can be more lenient, and if it takes 7 minutes, that's also okay. Then we move on to koreich. So for koreich, we eat the koreich sandwich. Now we take a kazayas of the bottom matzah, so we don't need to take the whole bottom matzah, just a kazayas of it. We take a kazayas of the chazeres from the kaira. Now over here, since it's going to be put together with the matzah, we're not going to put the charesis in wine. Rather, we place some dry charesis on the chazeres, and then again, like we did by the maror, we shake it off. We make a sandwich of matzah and maror, and finally, we lean while eating the koreich, unlike by the maror where we did not lean. Then we move on to Shulchan Oreich, which is the Shabbos Yom Tov. And over here, there's a few things to keep in mind. Number 1, one eats as much as they need, and one may drink wine between the 2nd and 3rd cups. Number 2, we don't lean during Shulchan Oreich. Number 3, we begin by eating the beitzah from the kaira, which we dip in salt water. And this is a zecher for the avelos for the Churban Beis Hamikdash when we had the Karban Pesach. And the Rebbe would dip the beitzah 3 times in the salt water. Then we don't eat any roasted meat or chicken, so there shouldn't be any mistake like we're replacing or eating the Karban Pesach. And finally, we're extremely careful of gebruks. For example, like we'll see later, by Mayim Achreinim, we don't put it on the mouth. Then we move on to Tzafun. So Tzafun is when we eat the afikomen. So we take the afikomen and give each family member kazayas. Now, the afikomen is usually not big enough for that if there's a larger family, so we add to it if there isn't the kazayas for each one. Then we eat it while leaning. L'chatchila, a person should eat 2 kazesim. One is a zecher for the Karban Pesach, and one is a zecher for the matzah eaten with the Karban Pesach. Now, if a person doesn't feel like they could eat 2 kazesim, so they could eat one and make it tonight, that if it's supposed to be a zecher for the Karban Pesach, that's what it should be, and it's supposed to be a zecher for the matzah eaten with the Karban Pesach, so that's what it should be, because there's basically 2 different opinions about what it's a zecher for. Number 4, we make sure to eat it before chatzos. That's on the first night. The second night, we're not careful with chatzos. And number 5, we don't eat or drink anything afterwards. Then we move on to Beirach, which is when we bench birchas hamazon. And over here we begin by pouring koisei shel aliyah. We do that the first thing right after the instruction of Beirach, which is different than what's written in the Agada. In the Agada it says to do it later after Beirach, but the Rebbe did it earlier, sooner, at the first opportunity, to bring things of Mashiach quicker rather than delay them in any way. Number 2, we pour the 3rd kais, because that's the kais that we do birchas hamazon on. Number 3, we don't place mayim achreinim on the mouth, because like we said, we're very careful with gebruks. Number 4, everyone holds the kais until after Beini Yerushalayim. Number 5, after Birchas Hamazon, we drink the 3rd kais. Number 6, afterwards, we pour the 4th kais after Birchas Hamazon. Number 7, someone goes with a candle to open all doors leading to the outside, and we say Shvei Chamascha. Number 8, the Rebbe Shap told the Frierdiker Rebbe, in general throughout the Seder, a person can ask for whatever they need. And he told him especially by Shvei Chamascha, and he told him, don't ask for Gashmias, ask for Ruchnias. Then we move on to Halel. So over here we say Halel. Now we already began saying Halel, as we'll see later in Maggid. We said the beginning, the first 2 paragraphs of Halel, the first 2 prokim, the first 2 kapitlach. So over here we continue Halel from where we ended in Maggid. Immediately afterwards, after saying Halel, we drink the 4th kais and then make a bracha achreina. Then we conclude by saying 1 time L'shana haba b'Yerushalayim. Afterwards, we pour the wine from Kodesh Shalio back into the bottle, and it was done by the Rebbe while singing Keli Ata. Now, one thing regarding Halel, which is that for certain parts, like by the Heidul Hashem and Ana Hashem, one leads and the others respond. And then finally, we come to Nirtza, which is that Hashem accepts everything that we did in the Seder.